Good evening. My name is Geoffrey Chalmers, and this is a audiovisual presentation of a talk I gave at Longwood Country Club September 21, 2021. And the subject matter was the exploration of how we see, both as applied to hitting a tennis ball and being an artist. Being a little bit of both, I decided I wanted to straddle it all and see if I could make some sense of it. The fact of the matter is that the process of adjusting oneself to the flight of a tennis ball is not dissimilar to the kind of painting I do, which is outdoor painting in the Impressionist style. In both cases, you got to use your eyes. And you have to be aware of the big difference between what your eyes are recording and what it is that's really out there, and the image that you have in your head of what's out there. That's, I think, encapsulated particularly by the perception that the Dada artists had around the turn of the last century. That's a big distinction between the image and the actual object. Mr. Magritte did it with a pipe, and I've done it with a tennis ball. There are all kinds of philosophers out there about this process. One of them is Yogi Berra, as usual. But after you finish laughing at his wry remark, you understand that it has a certain profoundness to it, because he's separated the process of taking the image in with what your reaction is. And that's what the subject of this talk is all about. People have thought about this for a long time, all kinds of people. Mr. Thoreau, who spent a lot of time looking at trees and bushes, was able to articulate it. It's not what you look at, but what you see. Indeed, that verb to see is overworked in the English language because it applies to a whole lot of different things which are complicated and take place in sequence. I hope you see my point. Anyway, what we're going to do here is to look into what makes up the whole complex of perceiving and acting on an object or a landscape. It really divides itself into three P's: the preparation for the act of seeing, the mechanics of how we see, the perception of the gap between what it is that we're seeing and what we have in our heads. And then at the end, the reaction that our body has with respect to what we've seen. I can say off the top of my head here that we should be aware that the process of seeing is actually stretched out in time. We often think of what we've seen in relationship to photographs or other static images that we're used to dealing with day to day. But this process here takes a longer time, and it has to be viewed that way. One way you can look at it is to compare what our eyes do with what a camera does, and then ultimately what a painting does. One tend to think of a camera image as comparable to a painting, but it's really not. In the case of a camera, you have one lens, and the eye has two lenses. The painting is a two-dimensional image that results from the application of two lenses over an extended period of time. Not only that, but the painter moves around, whether he's indoors or outdoors. So the painting surface is the composite of a lot of multiple perspectives that are being laid down on that two-dimensional surface. The wonderful invention of landscape painting allows one to do more than one can do with a camera, because it's possible to change and alter the image right on the surface. And finally, in terms of the persistence thereof, one understands that all one has at the end of a day of observing is a memory which itself fades. Whereas in the case of a camera and a painting, those memories are somehow encapsulated, and the art of it is how to do so in a way that persists. Now, to compare a tennis player and an artist, let me see what we have here. The tennis player is always in motion. The artist is trying to make sense of what it is he's observing by placing what is observed on an exterior surface, whereas the painter is simply trying to create a tennis stroke. The whole thing takes place at high speed for a tennis player, whereas for an artist, it's a matter of time. So when you're looking at a painting done by an artist, it's a product of hours of work, even though it may capture an instant emotion. There's a lot of opportunity, therefore, for the artist to refine the image. In the case of tennis, the goal is to win the point. As far as the artist is concerned, the goal is to communicate what it is that the artist has perceived. Now to launch into the meat of the process, preparation. At this point, I'm looking at what one goes through at the point when an image shows up in your brain. I'm going to be pretty rudimentary about this because I don't intend this to be a technical discussion of how the eye works. But as one can see, the main optic nerve gets input from the back of the retina, and that is conveyed to the straight to the visual cortex in the back of the brain through a bundle of nerves, and that is immediately compared to images which are already stored there and translated into action through the cerebellum. That whole process is relatively plastic, and I might say the result of several different internal processes that take place within the brain. Again, I won't be boring you with too much technical detail, but the fact of the matter is that we see in small bites of observation called saccades, and these are combined by us in our brain into a series of images. Normally, we don't even notice because we've done this since early childhood. But when you get into a high stress situation, these saccades transform themselves into what's called smooth pursuit movements. The smooth pursuit movements can be refined through practice, and they are able to create an image which can be acted upon in a very consistent manner. The only question is where and how does that image fall in your brain? Our mind is not as fast as reality. The hand is quicker than the eye. Many people have said it many different ways. T.S. Eliot said, between the motion and the act falls the shadow. And in that shadow area, a lot of things go on, including images that we've made up in our own minds about what we think we're seeing. I'm just simply going to show you a series of images which point this out. Some of you will see a boy sitting on the side of a pond. Others will see a Russian gentleman staring into space. And so it goes. Some will see a Mexican on a horse. Others will see an old man munching on it. We're also prey to misapprehensions about size and relationships in space. You can ask yourself which one of these yellow dots is bigger than the other. They're both the same size. Similarly, we all know about these floor artists. There's no dip in this floor at all. It's all the result of an optical illusion. Now, there's considerable research that's been done in the process of how that perception is translated into action. And the bottom line is, how does the brain manage to match all these impulses that are coming across at top speed in a way that makes sense? Well, when you look at a tennis player, you're very often told by the tennis coach, bystanders, and others that you have to have your eye on the ball. What does that mean? Well, plain meaning would seem to say that you've got to watch that ball every inch of the way as it travels from your opponent over the net to your racket. In fact, that is not what happens. I began to take a look at all this when I was preparing for this talk, and I did a bunch of pictures of all the top tennis players. Here's Federer and Djokovic, and way back when, Rocket Rod Laver. Look at where all their eyes are. Nowhere near the ball. They're up somewhere in outer space. Nadal, Federer, even Serena. And here's Billie Jean King and her worthy opponent. Every single one of them, they're not watching the ball. So the question is, what are they watching? What kind of attunement and input are they taking in as part of this process? It turns out that what they're looking at is the flight of the ball. And here's a very well-known character. He's also got his eyes off the ball. So you have to see that we're looking at a process that is more complicated than what might ordinarily be described as a very simple act of swinging a tennis racket. That has been compounded by the growth in the sport as it became more popular during the 60s and 70s. The size of the racket increased and the size of the racket face, so that gave more opportunity for the stroke to be developed in a more sophisticated fashion. And now there are indeed some respectable teachers in the tennis area that point out that in order to improve as a tennis player, your focus should not necessarily be simply on watching the ball. It should be on the whole situation that you're dealing with, including the way your opponent sets up the stroke and the direction and the speed he hits it at. It's a process of becoming absolutely wedded to the circumstances. Now, that's not unlike what an impressionist painter does. In fact, the great discovery of the impressionist painters was that they were able to import the visual experience directly onto the canvas. And that was done through imagining the dynamic nature of what they were looking at. Instead of looking at the image in a static fashion, as their predecessors did, they're importing motion and encouraging you as the observer to participate. Monet's initial painting from Honfleur called Sunrise Impressions is a perfect example of this. If you really get up close to it, you understand that it's a bunch of dabs and strokes, but you're bidden to accumulate this much the same way as you would if you were standing there looking at it. And Monet devoted his life to pointing out to people that perceptions of this nature were very local, very real, and related to an instant in time, so that you could capture a given object or a given scene in many different ways. His haystack paintings are a good example. Here's one from early morning, in which he points out to you in his own way that the collection of colors that you see in the early morning is quite different than what you see at a different season and in a different light. Indeed, Monet's eye was such that he managed to understand the enormous influence that atmosphere has on what you're seeing and how you think of it. Here's a picture he did of the London buildings, and then his American counterpart, Charles Hassan, did the same thing. Here's a field which is entirely constructed from dabs of color. And if in fact you stand before it, you feel as if you were there. You can almost feel the field's extraordinary perception of space. This painting is very particular. It doesn't look like much, but if you stand and stare at it long enough, it's in the National Gallery, you'll actually see the mist rising in front of you. All that gray blue out there is a mist. It was a total tour de force because he basically showed how you can visualize motion on a two-dimensional surface, almost as if it were a movie camera. Here he is doing steam from the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris. Astonishing, unbelievable. So how does a painter absolutely capture all of these impressions in a manner that makes sense? There's a technique that can be taught to do that, and it has to do with identifying and prying apart the essential elements of what you're looking at, and then gradually combining them through various stages. You can see in this demonstration, we start with a simple crude painting of an object, its light side and its shadow side, as it progresses to further refinement until the final image is produced. And that's the result of much training of the eye. And it's very similar to a tennis stroke, in that as you get better and better, your vision of what it is that you're hitting becomes more and more refined. Here's an example of a precious painting I did recently, and my palette, and I spend a lot of my time painting out of doors, and with a little bit of effort, it's possible to get very close to the almost photographic reproduction of the image. This is a photograph, and this is a painting. Photograph, painting. So I did this by simply going through a matching of all the individual elements of this thing, and then gradually pulling them together until all of a sudden they emerged and they came alive with a certain reality to it. This is one of the early paintings I did of Boston Harbor. Now, in order to experience the reality of what you're living in when you're doing a painting or you're playing tennis, you must strive to get into the zone. And what is the zone? It's a state of suspended perception in which you and the object are as one. I've had this experience both in painting and in tennis. Many years ago, I was privileged to be a linesman at an Arthur Ashe exhibition match in Washington, D.C. And I sat there for 2 hours behind Mr. Ashe and watched him hit the ball. And the very next day, I had my usual tennis match, and I could do no wrong. My mind had been completely overtaken, and I was able to imitate his stroke, believe it or not. Unfortunately, that went away after half an hour, so I couldn't try for a Grand Slam next year. But then I've had that experience painting as well. I was up in Maine, actually several times, and I reached a point of total stillness when my ability to perceive and be at one with the moment was undisturbed. And I was able to produce some pretty interesting results. I'm convinced that that's really the only way you learn. I'll close with a bunch of paintings that I did that may have some relevance. I did this as a commission for Mr. Kaufman. It was given to him as a present. Here's the open competition that was held at Longwood for years and years until I tore down the stadium. So I was made into a poster, which I sold. And there's the clubhouse. I also sometimes get interested in history. This is an English painting by the painter Turner called The Fighting Temeraire. And I basically copied it. So it was the Fighting Constitution. And here's Christina by N.C. Wyeth sitting on a beach in Florida. This is Old Orchard Beach up in Maine from this last summer. A cranberry bog from Nantucket. This is up in near Portsmouth, Rye Beach, New Hampshire, Gloucester. So then you ask yourself, well, is it possible to create the sensation of motion and instant activity in a painting? And you can see that Leroy Lehman does this by lathering it with lots of different color. And that's what I think many painters often do in order to create the impression that there's emotion. Here's another such painting. However, you could do it another way, and that's by actually getting yourself into the zone. Here's a painting that I did years ago of an athletic contest out in the basin in Boston. And I think it is every bit as full of motion as any of these others. I don't think I had to slap a lot of extra painting on it. All I had to do was observe. So I'll point out in closing that, again, our friend Mr. Elliott really has it right. That is, at the still point of the turning world, there the dance is. There's neither rest nor movement. Past and future are gathered. Except for that point, the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. So I'll leave it to you to figure out how to turn that into your lives for fun and profit. Thank you very much.